What did Thomas Jefferson really believe on race?
Oh, he certainly did not think that all men are created equal. He thought that black people are very likely to be less intelligent than whites. He was opposed to slavery, but he was also very much opposed to the idea of blacks and whites living equally free in the same society. In the Jefferson Memorial, there's a quotation from him. And the quotation is, "Nothing is more certainly written in the book of fate than that these people, black people, shall be free." And in the Jefferson Memorial, the sentence ends there with a period. In his original Notes on the State of Virginia, it went on to continue, "Nor is it equally possible that they could ever live together under the same government in a state of freedom." In other words, he wanted them to be free, but he wanted them to shipped out. But that aspect is completely excised from what we find in the Jefferson Memorial. So even in I believe it was 1939 when the memorial was put up, even then we were censoring Jefferson on race.
What did Hamilton really believe on race?
Well, Hamilton thought that even Europeans had to shuck whatever was European about them to come live in America. They had to shed their European skin, as I believe he called it. He never would have dreamed of letting in non-Europeans into the United States. He too thought of the United States as a country that was developed, created by Europeans for fellow Europeans. Ben Franklin, of the real founders, wrote very little about race itself, but he did say that there are very few whites generally in the world itself. If you take all of the world's population into consideration, there aren't that many whites. But he said, let us make this a country that will be populated by whites. Why bring blacks, for example, to North America when there are so few whites in the world to begin with? Let's let this be a country for us. Abraham Lincoln we think of as the great emancipator, and he did wish to emancipate the slaves, but he did not want to set them up as the equals to whites. He didn't want them to have the vote. He didn't want them serving on juries. He couldn't imagine them playing a role in government. His idea was, once they were freed, to send them outside of the United States. Even during the Civil War, he's got a serious war on his hand. He appointed a special minister to go to Central America and find a place where the liberated slaves could be sent so that they would not have to mix with white people and live under the same government. And during the war, he invited a delegation of black people to the White House. This is the first time blacks were invited officially to the White House. And he asked them to prepare their people to leave the country. Teddy Roosevelt, he thought that the United States was built for white people and that it should remain that way. He had this notion that bringing blacks was a terrible mistake, but he couldn't think of a good solution to the problem. He was typical of his time in that respect. Woodrow Wilson described Birth of a Nation as history written with lightning. He was so impressed by it. He thought that there should be general territorial separation, that it was no good mixing the races up. Entirely typical for his time. Dwight Eisenhower, he reluctantly agreed that blacks had to be given certain civil rights, but he did not believe in social equality. He said, just because we give blacks civil rights does not mean that a Negro should come courting my daughter. Also, when he sent the army down to Little Rock, Arkansas to help integrate the schools there, he looked back on that as the most disagreeable and awful decision he'd ever had to make. He regretted having to force integration on the state of Arkansas. He was by no means a racial egalitarian himself, but like so many Americans, he felt there was a terrible dilemma. Here were blacks. They had been subject to all kinds of oppressive treatment. What was the right way to proceed? Was Jim Crow correct? No. Was slavery correct? Even worse. But was complete equality correct? He couldn't countenance that either. This has been the terrible dilemma Americans have faced about race ever since blacks have been brought to this country.
How about some of the later presidents that weren't in your article? Jimmy Carter or Ford? Did they have any?
Oh, well, Jimmy Carter was very much an egalitarian. He was very much the kind of president that modern Americans would approve of. Oh, he talked about growing up with blacks, of the kinds of disadvantages that blacks have faced. I'm sure he would tell you that any inability of blacks to achieve at the same level of whites is due to the oppressive environment that whites have created. One interesting example, of course, of a white president who has often been called the first black president, that is to say, Bill Clinton. Perhaps you will recall that when Barack Obama was first threatening his wife as a potential candidate for the President of the United States or for the Democratic nomination, he referred to Barack Obama as the sort of guy, this guy used to be, he's the kind of guy who used to bring us coffee, referring to the fact that he's a black man. Somehow this comment by Bill Clinton has been forgiven him. But if a Republican had said that this is the kind of guy who used to bring us coffee, we would never hear the end of it. But all of these people, both Bushes, Clinton, all of these people in their public pronouncements, of course, say the things that are expected of them. But Hillary Clinton, in her private life, does she celebrate diversity? If she ever lets her hair down and has a beer with pals, I mean, I don't know if she ever does this kind of thing. Does she pal around with black people or Asians? I suspect that she's most comfortable with white people. Where Hillary Clinton has chosen to live, since she and Bill have left Washington, they have bought a house in Chappaqua, New York. It's about as white a place as you can find this side of Iceland. There's a tremendous amount of hypocrisy in what our elites say about diversity and about race. They say, oh, diversity is wonderful, but it's as if it's such a wonderful thing, they themselves are going to nobly forego it, so that the poor slobs who live in trailer parks, who can't afford to move out, have to share diversity with people who don't speak English, or who keep chickens next door that crow in the middle of the night, or who play ranchera music, who take over the baseball diamonds and play soccer on them. No, we will nobly forego this wonderful diversity so that, you poor working class slobs, you can enjoy the diversity that we're importing into your country. No, the people who run this country, look at the way they actually spend their lives. Who do they invite to their dinner parties? Who do they spend their vacations with? Who are their real friends? Who do they have their children marry? Don't see much diversity that they practice. We're supposed to celebrate it. Those guys run from it screaming when it's actually part of their own personal lives.